Dilemma, the podcast of Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen to a talk by Alan McPherson, the Thomas J. Freeney Professor of History at Temple University and Director of the Center for Study of Force and Diplomacy there. McPherson speaks about an incident recounted in his book, Ghosts of Sheridan Circle, which deals with the September 1976 assassination of Orlando Letelier and human rights activist Ronnie Moffett in Washington, D.C. Letelier had served briefly as the Chilean ambassador to the United States, and then served first as Foreign Affairs Minister and then Defense Minister under President Salvador Allende. When General Pinochet took power in Chile in a coup, Letelier was arrested, exiled, and ultimately became an activist against the Pinochet regime. We pick up the conversation as McPherson describes the arrest of Letelier in his office.
On September 11th, Orlando Letelier served as Chile's Minister of Defense. When he showed up to his ministry after hearing rumors of a coup, plotters took him prisoner and shipped him to Dawson Island, a Nazi-style concentration camp in the deep frozen south of Chile. And here we have a rare photograph of Letelier being arrested by his own men on the morning of the coup. There in Dawson Island and in other detention centers, he would remain for a year. Never charged with a crime, psychologically tortured and emaciated, until the Venezuelan government obtained his freedom. Before his release, Letelier was told in no uncertain words, General Pinochet will not and does not tolerate activities against his government. So essentially warned, you do anything, and we're going to assassinate you. Still, Letelier ended up working against Pinochet in Washington. His work coincided with the golden age of human rights activism in the mid-1970s. And this is the other great force, right, opposed to fascism. At that time, in the mid-70s, more than 200 groups in the United States worked on human rights. Over 50 lobbied Congress, and about 15 concentrated on Latin America. Civil rights icon Patricia Darien became the first Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor under the Carter administration just a few months after this assassination. Mark Schneider, her deputy, had worked for Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts on several U.S. Latin American issues. So we had people in administration working for human rights. In Congress, Representative Don Frazier chaired the first congressional hearings on human rights in 1973. Helping him were, among others, Tom Harkin, Michael Harrington, Toby Moffett, and George Miller in the House, and Edward Kennedy, James Aburesque, and George McGovern in the Senate. These were all Democrats. On Chile, Congress's greatest achievement was 1975's Harkin Amendment, which cut off aid to any government that grossly violated human rights unless the president determined that such aid would directly benefit the needy. The following year, Edward Kennedy directly targeted Chile, marking the first time that Congress ended military aid to another government because of human rights. One Chilean magazine called Kennedy the most dangerous foreign adversary of the Pinochet regime. Letelier, helped by Ronnie and Michael Moffett, right, both worked at IPS, worked in this environment. IPS was one of the most important, influential human rights organizations in the country. Letelier met with top State Department officials. He taught at American University. He lunched with senators. Angela Davis once came to his house. Joan Baez was a friend. Richard Avedon photographed him. Right? In sum, he was a minor celebrity. Most important, Letelier became a unifier for Chilean exiles, numbering in the hundreds of thousands worldwide. He also convinced Holland's Dock Workers Federation to boycott the handling of Chilean goods, and thereby won the cancellation of a planned $62 million mining investment. So these two things, on the one hand, the ability to sort of get a lot of Chileans to back him, and on the other hand, being able to really damage Pinochet's economy by ending investments. These two things seem to have convinced Pinochet to order the hit on him. And this hit was part of something much greater called Operation Condor, right? A conspiracy among South American dictators to assassinate each other's political opponents in each other's countries, but also outside of South America. Roughly from 1975 to 1983, Contreras and his South American allies killed several hundred people outside Chile. At looking away from such brutalities, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger became an expert. 1 month before Letelier was killed, his State Department prepared a memo signed by Kissinger that instructed Southern Cone ambassadors to express to South American dictators Washington's, quote, deep concern over their plans for the assassination of subversives, politicians, and prominent figures, both within the national borders of certain Southern Cone countries and abroad. Right? So Kissinger orders his ambassadors in South America to tell the dictators, we know what you're doing, we know what you're planning, don't assassinate your leaders outside your countries. Right? Inside your countries, we're not going to tell you what to do, but don't do so outside your countries. But for 1 whole month, none of the ambassadors carried out the order. Right? Something very rare in diplomacy. Usually if you're given an order by the Secretary of State, you carry it out. The ambassador to Uruguay feared for his life if he wagged his finger at the generals. The envoy to Chile worried that Pinochet, quote, might well take it as an insult, any inference that he was connected with such assassination plots. 5 days before the Letelier assassination, Kissinger ordered that no further action be taken on this matter. Kissinger himself rescinded his order right before the assassination. Back in Chile, in the same summer of 1976, Contreras, right, the head of the secret police, acting through his chief of operations, Pedro Espinosa, 2 important names, right, Contreras and Espinosa, entrusted the hit on Letelier to Michael Townley, an American Chilean explosives expert. And here he is with his wife, and she's also very important in the story and the book. During the Allende years, right, when there was lots of conspiracies against Allende, Townley worked with proto-fascist youth shock troops called Fatherland and Freedom, or Patria y Libertad. Recruits to Fatherland and Freedom received training in coding and code breaking, weapons handling, explosives, and martial arts, even with nunchucks. Leader Pablo Rodriguez would regularly line up his quote-unquote troops and review them with his right arm crossed against his chest. They wore black uniforms with white armbands adorned with a swastika-like insignia that united chain links and resembled a spider. If you know anything about Nazi Germany, you know that Hitler's brown shirts would have approved of this sort of organization. Allende's followers called Fatherland and Freedom, quote, a bunch of fascists paid by the CIA. And it turns out they were absolutely correct. Rodriguez denied accepting CIA funding, but the truth is that in fall 1970, Kissinger requested and received $38,000 for covert support of Fatherland and Freedom. Others in the group admitted receiving those funds and added that an extra $5,000 per month filtered into the group. Townley, the bomb maker, embraced the rhetoric and the actions of Fatherland and Freedom. The masses are not ready to govern themselves, the American Chilean once intoned. Democracy leads only to mass government, ruled by the herd. Power should be reserved for the qualified few, the intellectuals, the philosopher kings. Let me tell you, he was not a philosopher king. In the United States, Townley connected with about 5 Cuban Americans, another group, which are also proto-fascists. They call themselves the Cuban Nationalist Movement, headquartered in a New Jersey, newly Cubanized since the Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. By the 1970s, these Cuban Americans were also disenchanted with the U.S. government, which had dropped them as assets against Castro. Here's a few of them. These are actually the Novo brothers, or the leaders of this very small group that end up helping Townley at their headquarters in New Jersey, not particularly fancy place. Their logo is actually more important here. It's got the map of Cuba with the hammer and sickle being smashed by lightning, which signifies violence, right? So they're all about using violence. And the number 3 actually stands for the third way, or a third way in the Cold War, right? Not communism, obviously, but also not liberal democracy, right? They want something in between. And I'll explain to you what it is. I wouldn't really say in between, but something other. So like Contreras, these Cuban Americans had decided to kill opponents throughout the world. Soon, bombs exploded in New York, Montreal, Miami, Lima, Mexico City, Merida, Kingston, Madrid, London, and Paris. And here I'm talking about sort of a larger Cuban American terrorist, right, sort of a universe, if you want, of small groups. Between 1974 and 1976, U.S. authorities tied 202 major bombings in 23 countries to Cuban exiles, one every 5 days on average, and 113 of them in the United States. In 1974, Cuban exiles accounted for 45% of all terrorist bombings on the planet. Think about this. 45% of all bombings on the planet. And this is a wave of terrorism that we've almost completely forgotten in American history. And most of it happened in the United States. So this smaller group, the CNM's motto was Cuba before all, recalling Nazi Germany's Deutschland über alles. Its pamphlets outlined an ideology centered on a syndicalist capitalism akin to those of Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, and of course, Fatherland and Freedom. Many of these guys had Hitler posters on their walls. One Cuban member of a more mainstream organization dismissed the CNM as right-wing extremists and fascists. One of these Cubans once asked Michael Townley and his wife during a dinner, "What do you think about the world Jewish conspiracy?" in capital letters. "I beg your pardon, the what?" said Townley's wife. Turns out she was actually, she considered herself not anti-Semitic at all. She had lived in Israel in a kibbutz, and so this kind of thing really shocked her. "The Jewish conspiracy," he said. "It's going to destroy the world if we don't fight it. Before we do anything else, we must destroy the Jews." "It seems to me," she told him, "that you've gotten sidetracked on purpose. Fidel Castro is too difficult to target, so you've chosen the perennial target, the Jews. Naturally, it's easier to fight the Jews than the Cubans." Still, these Cubans helped Townley build the car bomb and install it under Letelier's car. One Cuban drove behind Letelier on the morning of September 21st, 1976, while another pushed the button on the detonator. So the men who actually physically killed him are two Cuban Americans. For Washington and the Washington establishment, the challenge that the Letelier assassination posed was in clarifying the divisions between those such as Kissinger, who enabled fascism to infiltrate the Chilean government, those such as Teddy Kennedy, who championed human rights, and the vast majority of officials in the middle who needed the car bombing to prompt them to care enough and to kind of make up their mind. Early on, right after the assassination, mainstream U.S. observers tended toward absolving the Chilean regime. The New York Times' editors concluded, quote, that it's hard to believe that even as ham-handed a regime as Chile's junta would order the murder of so eminent an opponent as Mr. Letelier in the capital of the United States. The National Security Council, writing the day of the assassination, admitted that, quote, right-wing Chileans are the obvious candidates, but they seem to be too obvious. Thankfully, investigation was not up to the NSC. It was the job of the FBI and the Attorney General's office. These men, led by Eugene Proper, were anti-communists, but also gifted technocrats, dedicated to solving this murder wherever it took them. This is Eugene Proper in Chile investigating the crime. For almost 18 months, the FBI and its team had no solid lead. It heard of a mysterious gringo among Chileans, but had no name. And this gringo turned out to be Michael Townley. It heard rumors from Cuban Americans. A grand jury subpoenaed them, but they kept mum. And the investigation kept getting threats, just as Orlando and Isabel had before the assassination. On October 4th, so just a few weeks after the assassination, an unknown male called Orlando Letelier's aunt, Maria del Solar. "Maria, Maria, Maria," he said condescendingly. "Talking to the FBI won't help you. Your legs will be spread in Washington, D.C.'s just like Orlando's." Then he hung up. In early November, investigator Larry Wack's fiancé, a flight attendant about to join her crew, was standing in Kennedy Airport, rifling through her purse for her key to an American Airlines office. Suddenly, a man grabbed her arm and yanked her around. "You tell your little friend Larry Wack to keep his fucking nose out of Chile's business, or you won't be so pretty anymore. Boom, boom. You know what I mean?" Of course, she was terrified, told her fiancé. And interestingly, they kind of pieced together that there must be some kind of alliance between these Cubans who are making threats and the Chileans, right? So the threats were really doing the opposite. President-elect Jimmy Carter said in November 1976, if they can do this and get away with it under the nose of the CIA and the FBI, then no president can govern. He was talking about this assassination. On one hand, Carter meant that such a brazen attack on a Chilean dissident on U.S. soil was unacceptable to the U.S. policymaking apparatus, whether Republican or Democrat. It made the United States look unable to police its own borders. It made the Cold War seem out of control. On the other hand, foreign policymakers were careful about pushing a Cold War ally too hard. One U.S. political officer in Chile explained that we were not against the Chilean government. We were not against what the military had done. In other words, we're not against the coup. We were against the abuse of it and the terrorism that had been performed in its name. I should add, especially when it comes to the United States. So it was often up to non-state actors, Isabel Letelier, Michael Moffat, and human rights organizations, such as IPS, to pressure Carter officials against the Chileans. First, to expel Townley from Chile. They wanted two things: expel Townley from Chile, which proved successful, and second, to extradite Contreras and other Chileans, which proved a failure. Give you an example. When Pinochet once traveled to Washington, Carter met him in the Oval Office and brought up human rights and his determination to get to the bottom of the Letelier crime. So he did confront Pinochet on this. Pinochet nodded and promised cooperation. But my book reveals how behind the scenes the dictator orchestrated a cover-up. Letelier and Moffat, therefore, did what they could. They were aghast. Moffat asked at a press conference, if Carter is serious about human rights, why doesn't he welcome Isabel and me just like he's welcoming Pinochet? The widow and the widower wrote the president for a meeting. But National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski denied them. Brzezinski didn't help at all, Letelier told me. We could never get through to him. Never. In her activism, Letelier focused attention on Pinochet's likely responsibility for the assassination. College and local newspapers covered her, as did local radio and television. Right? This is the Human Rights Network in action. When the right-wing media in the U.S. tried to smear Orlando as a tool of Fidel Castro, Isabel debunked their lies. The dam finally burst when, in March 1978, investigators published photos of two men whose names they ignored, but whom they suspected of being involved. These were the actual photos they published in a Washington newspaper, and then it got published in a Chilean newspaper. They only had photos and no names because these two men had applied for visas earlier in the year, and their application got separated from the photos. The U.S. government only had the photos. But they knew these two men had applied to come and that had come to Chile during the summer. So they were here during the assassination. So the gamble they took is, if we publish the photos, the Chileans might, of course, know who these guys are and disappear them. And then we have no witnesses. But if we don't publish the photos, we'll never know who they are. So they published the photos. They got lucky. Within days, Chileans identified Michael Townley and Armando Fernandez as the two men from Chile who were in the United States during the assassination. Gene Proper and co-investigator Carter Cornick landed in Santiago the following morning. Now the investigation really gets going. Proper and his beard roused some suspicions among conservative Chilean officials. Was he a hippie? Was he a Jew? The Americans saw no trace of a Chilean manhunt for Townley. And they were certain that instead, the Chileans were prevaricating while hiding Townley. So the FBI did a really great professional job here. And so did many U.S. diplomats. One example of such a diplomat was the ambassador George Landau, U.S. ambassador to Chile. For instance, he demanded a meeting with the Chilean foreign minister over this. Once meeting with him, he dropped all the diplomatic politesse he had practiced over his career, and he threatened that if Townley was not made to answer the U.S. government's questions, all U.S. relations with Chile would be endangered. Trade, loans, investment, diplomatic relations. We're going to all break it off if we don't get to talk to Townley. Frankly, I don't believe your people are trying very hard, Landau blurted, which is something very rare in diplomacy, right? You're never really impolite with a counterpart and certainly not a minister. This kind of put the fear in God in the Chileans. Shortly after, on the 15th floor of the building out of which he ruled, Pinochet's political team met, setting as its task keeping Townley in Chile. Suddenly, the French doors of the meeting room swung open, and in walked Pinochet. The dictator rarely descended below his 22nd floor, so this meant something. Please continue. Don't mind me, the strong man instructed his advisors while he paced behind their chairs. Then he interrupted. We were doing so well, ready to take off. And then this. This is a banana peel, senores. If we step on it, the government will fall. We will fall. As abruptly as he entered, he left the room, without telling them what to do. Pinochet's anxiety, however, seemed to change the momentum of the meeting. Talk of avoiding Townley's expulsion switched to handing him over to the Americans. Within weeks, Townley was stateside, spilling all the Chilean secrets on the assassination. And this is how we know all the details of how it happened. He made a deal with the United States government and served about 3 years in U.S. prisons and is likely now still living in the Witness Protection Program. 3 Cuban Americans were also tried, but their guilty verdicts were soon after thrown out on technicalities. The champions of human rights had won a limited victory. But Pinochet remained in power, and Contreras, though demoted, remained free. The Chilean courts refused to extradite him, Espinosa, and Fernandez. So that was now the demand of the American government, extradite these three Chileans. Of course, that included, he had been demoted, but included the former head of essentially the Chilean CIA. Right? So it's sort of understandable that Chileans would said, absolutely no way. We would certainly never send a former CIA, director to another country if he was accused of a crime there. My book is the first to recount what happened over the next 15 years. After about 1980, the story shifted to Chile, where fascists and human rights champions remained in conflict. Isabel Letelier and her family kept the legal case technically alive against Contreras, Espinosa, and Fernandez. But they held out little hope of an actual trial. In the United States, the Reagan government repealed Carter's already weak sanctions. Crucially, however, Democrats in Congress forced the executive to quote-unquote certify that Chile was making progress on the Letelier-Moffat case in order to allow military-to-military relations. So the U.S. government could not have normal relations with the Chilean military until the Chileans showed progress on this one specific case. Right? On a few other things too, human rights in general, but specifically on this case. So Congress is really what kept this case alive during the 80s. It took a few breaks in the late 80s and early 90s to reinvigorate the case. First break was the defection in 1987 of Armando Fernandez, the third man in the extradition. And he had surveilled Letelier in Washington. Nothing particularly serious as a crime. For the first time, American officials heard all the details about Pinochet's orchestration of the cover-up. Fernandez ended up spending only 21 months in Chilean hospitals and U.S. prisons. But it was the first conviction of a Chilean military man in U.S. courts. It also seems to have led the CIA to conclude that Pinochet not only covered up the crime, but also ordered the hit, a conclusion that came to light only in 2015, after I started research on this book. In 1990, another defection of sorts confirmed Fernandez's story. Monica Lagos, a former dancer and later an escort for Dina, or rather a prostitute for the Chilean CIA, had accompanied Fernandez to Washington to act as his wife under the pseudonym Liliana Walker. She had disappeared from everyone's radar and spent much of the 1980s suffering from debilitating alcoholism, drug addiction, and schizophrenia. So for more than a decade, all that investigators had, even the Chilean government, all they had was Liliana Walker. Nobody seemed to know her real name, and she just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. On April 17th, 1990, Chileans awoke to a dramatic front-page headline in that morning's La Época newspaper. "I am Liliana Walker," it declared, accompanied by a 1976 passport photo. An intrepid journalist had found Monica Lagos living at her parents' house. At this point, the Reagan and Bush governments had turned against Pinochet. The Democratic opposition led the way. The press felt free to criticize the regime. And as a result, Pinochet lost a referendum on his rule. In early 1990, a new Democratic government was in power. Because of the Fernandez and the Lagos confessions, the Letelier case could now be reopened in Chilean courts. 3 years later, they found Contreras and Espinosa guilty. In 1995, the Supreme Court ratified the decisions. Contreras spent the rest of his life in prison or in detention of some kind until he died in 2015. Espinosa is still in prison, and he's probably going to serve another 500 years before he gets out. The Letelier assassination stands as one of the most consequential assassinations of the Cold War. In Chile, the Letelier quest for justice brought about the dissolution of DINA and eventually defanged the country's amnesty law, which prevented the prosecution of Pinochet-era atrocities. It forced the Reagan government to put decisive diplomatic and financial pressure on the dictatorship. Contreras and Espinosa were the first of Pinochet's military officers to go to prison and among the first Cold War violators of human rights in Latin America or anywhere else to do so. The case sparked a movement that has adjudicated more than 1,000 cases of human rights violations in Chile alone. The case produced several firsts. The first deal against extradition when the United States had an extradition treaty with another country. The first charges ever filed in the American legal system against Cuban-American terrorists. The first conviction of a Chilean military man in U.S. courts. And the first live telecast of Chilean court proceedings. In 1995, this was the O.J. Simpson case of Chile. Right? The first time people could see an entire case live on TV. And it was at the same time as the O.J. Simpson case. In civil courts, the case became the first filed under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act that dealt with terrorism. In 1996, it led to a law that stripped immunity from a foreign state when damages were sought against specific terrorist acts. One U.S. diplomat once said, "The Letelier assassination, in retrospect, was one of the more stupid things done by any government." That certainly is true. Pinochet, Contreras, and Townley did not understand the implications of car bombing a former ambassador and a U.S. citizen in the heart of Washington. It took decades, but their monstrous deed backfired, contributing in no small part to ending their ideological dream, their government, and in the last two cases, their personal freedom. All these are the result of a movement of human rights activists who correctly identified the fascist core of the Pinochet regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.